Hi, everyone. I'm here with Lawrence, one of our engineers here at Incident. Myself, I'm Norberto, VP of Engineering. And what we're going to be doing today is talk about Crowdstrike and everything that has transpired between Friday, when this whole thing started, and today. But we're not going to go too much into the technical details and all of the things we probably couldn't really know because we don't work at Crowdstrike. Instead, we're going to focus on what we care about as an incident management company. And there are probably three parts to this that we're going to go into. One is communication. Everyone knows communication is hard, especially in a critical period where you're trying to figure out what's going on and also have your customers understand what's happening, and even in your internal company or your internal folks in the company. And then we're also going to talk about reliability and processes around shipping and deploying and how that affected this specific incident, or at least how it seems from our point of view, and how that applies to your job as a SaaS engineer. And last but not least, we're going to talk about how handling incidents outside of your control is difficult and how you can deal with those a little bit better. All right. So it's going to be a bit meaty. Before we talk about any of that stuff, let's do a bit of a wrap around what has happened and the impact it had. So, Lawrence, why don't you guide us over the impact this thing had?
Yeah, sure. So I think anyone who's listening to this is probably pretty aware of some of the impact. In fact, it's probably quite likely that you were impacted. So I know, for example, some of my family were unable to get back from holidays last week because airlines and airports, who often run a lot of Windows machines, especially for the kiosks and the booths, they were affected by the CrowdStrike incident. They were blue screen of deathing. And if you've been on social media, you will have seen a ton of pictures of people seeing inappropriate large blue screen of deaths in like shopping malls and various other places. But there was also like more serious impact to this. So lots of hospitals run on Windows machines, and lots of hospitals, due to them being in a regulated industry, also install endpoint protection. So in this case, CrowdStrike, because they're probably the primary vendor in that area. And that means that there were doctors who were trying to perform MRIs or perform operations who otherwise couldn't because their systems were down at the time when that operation was scheduled. So there's been a huge amount of impact across the world, not just limited to any single region either. There's also impact that's coming out of the back of this. In fact, there are some companies who are still struggling now, trying to recover their devices, because it does take a while to recover a computer or an impacted system after it's failed. And some manual action is required just because the thing is so broken that actually you can't typically remotely fix the machine. So it means that lots of IT engineers across the planet right now are going through piles and piles of laptops trying to manually recover them. But there's also a ton of stuff that happens out the back of the incident, even now that it has kind of technically been remediated. So CrowdStrike are warning at the moment of phishing emails and phone calls of people posing as CrowdStrike staff. So obviously, given that it's so deep in public awareness now, and so close on people's minds, if you're trying to scam someone, if you contact them saying, hey, have you been affected by the CrowdStrike outage? And you can go from there, then potentially you can cause harm as someone trying to impersonate CrowdStrike staff. But there's a load of independent researchers who've claiming like maybe this was evidence of a cyber attack and offering remediation. So they're preying on people who might be concerned that the impact is not mitigated, or that there was something going on that CrowdStrike haven't been clear about. So there's a ton of horrible stuff that comes out the back of an outage like this, beyond just the initial impact. But yeah, I think it's probably worth going back to you, Norberto, just to give like a clear update and timeline on exactly what how this incident transpired.
Yeah, let's do it. For most people listening to this, you probably have a rough idea of what has occurred, but everything seems to have started on last Friday, 19th of July, around 5 a.m. London time, where CrowdStrike released a configuration update. And that update, when rolling out to computers that were online and were doing that update, that triggered an error which they've mentioned as a logic error, and that resulted in a system crash, which in turn caused what's called the blue screen of death, or BSOD. And then by 5:30 a.m. UTC, so this is 6:30 a.m. London time, about an hour and a half later, they had remediated on their end. And so if your computer hadn't picked up their configuration update and was now coming online, you wouldn't see any problems because now everything has been fixed. Then about a day later, they put a blog post up with some details. Didn't go into too many details, but at least it clarified some things, specifically some parts of speculation that were going on online. And the 24th of July, as we're recording this, this morning, they published what they call a preliminary post-incident review, in which they have stated that there will also be a root cause analysis coming and will be published publicly, which is quite nice. So all in all, we're less than 7 days in, but like you mentioned, Lawrence, lots of impact around the world. But going through the timeline, things have seemed to have gone pretty quickly from their point of view, specifically in resolution of the problem at a very raw level. Like, hey, we messed the thing, we fixed the thing. The cascading problems, like you've mentioned, haven't been fixed yet with some customers. But before we go any deeper into these timelines, I think one thing that people probably caught if they were on Twitter or on LinkedIn is how much people were craving communication and how much people were perceiving lack of communication. And communication is key for an incident. So I would love for us to go into communication. Was it good? Was it not good? Was it both? Lawrence, why don't you guide us a bit, how this whole thing came about?
Yeah, so I think communication in an incident, and we would know this, a large part of our product is external communication in the form of status pages that we host on behalf of our customers. But yeah, a large part of incident response is communicating to the people who are impacted, and it is really, really difficult. So I think when CrowdStrike first came out with their comms, there was a fair amount of criticism. I think people are rightly demanding a lot of detail about how this had happened and how long it was going to take to fix. But one of the challenges that you have when you're dealing with an incident is that you may not know for sure what timelines are on fixes. You may not know for sure exactly what caused the thing, and you can cause a lot more harm than good if you send out communications that you then have to roll back. That sort of thing is detrimental to your incident response because it causes confusion, and then you have to kind of close down the narrative that you created before and explain that actually you made a mistake and what you said in the previous update you no longer believe is true, and that could have sent people down on a totally different path of resolution that may have ended up wasting a lot of their resources. So it's really hard when you're communicating in an incident of this magnitude with people who care so much to try and find the right balance between the amount of detail that you want to share and trying to share the details that you're absolutely certain of and you won't need to go back on later. So I think actually probably what's more relevant if we're looking at their communication is to have a look at their more recent post-incident review, which I think they posted last night, was it? So they've sent several updates since the first messaging that they've sent out externally. And as the timeline has progressed, those updates have got consistently more and more detailed. The post-incident review that they posted last night goes into a lot more technical detail about exactly what happened. So we now know, for example, that this was a specific type of configuration change shipped to the Falcon sensor. So it wasn't a sensor update itself, it was just some configuration that gets shipped often much faster than they would normally do a normal release, because the whole point of these configuration changes are to respond very quickly to a changing threat environment. So there are reasons and there are kind of rationale around why it was released so quickly into the environments and why this incident happened as it did. But yeah, what was your view of the post-incident review, Norberto?
Yeah, I quite like that. I think, like you said, goes into a lot of detail, but the structure is what I would consider like best practice. They talk about like they go into here's what happened overall. They give a very brief. Everyone that's reading this, here's what you should know. Then they go into the what went wrong and why it went wrong, and that's the part where obviously people want to know the details, and they go into a fair amount of details there, which is again really nice. They talk about the differences between a sensor update and the rapid response content deployment, like all of these things. They go through that, including like how they test it, which is super nice. And then they go also into slightly more detail in relation with the testing, to kind of map the what happened with like what went wrong and why. And then they go into how do we prevent this from happening again? And that's the juicy bit. That's the core part for me. And oftentimes companies just give a banner response of like, we'll do better. But I think they went into a lot of detail. I don't know if you want to break it down, Lawrence, but I love that.
Yeah, no. So I think this is especially in a situation where you're a public company and you're beholden to your shareholders, and you have all of the liabilities involved when you're operating at that scale. It's very difficult for you to be as transparent as people kind of want you to be. But the stuff that I really liked about it was specifically going into kind of behind the scenes about how their process worked. So there's been a lot of criticism, rightly, I think, about how in our industry of engineering, normally you don't roll something out so that it hits all machines at once. But from what people can perceive, that's actually what happened inside of this incident. So they go into quite a lot of detail about how for the Falcon sensor themselves, they have quite a strict and gradual rollout process. So things like they dog food first, which is where you have people internal to your company pull down the update just to make sure that if there is anything harmful, you're the person that gets impacted before your customers do. They also have update policies that customers can apply to the Falcon sensor, which say, actually, I would like to lag maybe 1 or 2 release cycles behind what is normally released kind of like on the edge. I would imagine that most IT departments have already been familiar with this, and in fact the sensor itself, the Falcon sensor, was not the thing that went wrong in this situation. So the particularly interesting part of their post-incident review, for me at least, is that there is 2 ways that you can deploy software onto these machines where people have installed Crowdstrike. And the first is that you have this Falcon sensor, which is the thing that's actually installed into the kernel. That's kind of the program that you're running. But then there's these dynamic rapid response config changes, which are sent down to the machines that are sent far faster and through a totally different type of deployment process. And that's because, as far as Crowdstrike were aware, that the situation with a rapidly changing threat environment, which is a phrase you'll find in their docs quite a lot, means that they want to ship this stuff really quickly to machines so that they can quite quickly update them before maybe a virus or something worse ends up on these machines and takes them over. And that does make a ton of sense, but it meant that for a lot of the ways that they were handling these config updates, they weren't benefiting from all of this canary deployment, the gradual rollout, the dog fooding that they had for the Falcon sensor. Now, in this post-incident review, they actually start digging into exactly what they're going to do to change this in future, and you can see that they're properly considering how they can add gradual rollout and canarying and kind of this rollback facility for the configuration changes, along with things like fuzz testing configuration. So it sounds very much like their Falcon sensor loads this configuration, and it's extremely dynamic in a proprietary format. So it could be doing almost anything off the back of loading these configuration files, which, if you ask me, is probably why people misinterpreted exactly what the root cause of this was on Twitter. There's lots of people going, this was a null pointer exception. And from what I can see, at least, it looks like it might be a bit more complicated than just dereferencing a null. It looks very much like the configuration file may inject something that dynamically generates code, which in turn then tries and reads something in segfaults, rather than it being quite as naive as people first imagined. But yeah, I was really impressed at the amount of feedback or the amount of transparency they had inside of this review. It gave me a lot more confidence, or it gave me a lot more information than I would have otherwise had about how they're operating internally. And I liked what I saw about the things that they're going to change out the back of this, specifically the safeguards and the prevention steps that they're going to take around shipping those rapid response updates.
Yeah, I agree. It's super nice. And there's another part of communication which I haven't caught when I was reading the news up to this point, but they made it part of the post where they have the preliminary post-incident review, which is the statement from the CEO that was sent on the day of the incident, on the 19th. And I think this is probably like an email that was sent only to customers and partners, because it starts with valued customers and partners. And I saw a lot of people online complaining that they weren't communicating enough. And I read this letter, and the first thing the CEO obviously does, which is an obvious thing to do, is, hey, we're sorry. Like, we messed up, right? And this is something that they got flack publicly about not apologizing. And I thought this was fascinating because, look, they obviously communicated to the customers and partners. You just don't get to see it.
I think that comes up a load. Honestly, no matter what you say in an incident like this, you're going to either get criticism for being too apologetic and it feeling insincere, or not apologetic enough because people want to see you kind of groveling. I think, especially when you consider how the market has responded to this, I think Crowdstrike have a very serious appreciation for the impact of this incident. And given the extent that they've been going to in communicating the details of the outage and some of the prevention measures that they're saying they're putting in place, they are taking this very, very seriously. And I do think that the CEO was sincere when they said, we take the responsibility of making sure that this works for our customers very, very seriously. But that reminded me actually when you said something that you don't often see in the news and kind of public perception, is that a lot of people in the public space generating this discourse are not necessarily Crowdstrike customers themselves. So they're not benefiting, or they're not privy to the type of communication that Crowdstrike is sending out internally to customers. And that's something that we see a lot of incidents. So one of the features that we ship with our response product is this concept of internal status pages or customer status pages, where it's not always correct or beneficial to your customers to be as transparent in the same way and send the comms out to everyone in exactly the same way. In fact, that can actually cause more confusion or more impact than the incident itself did. You do not normally, as a customer of a company, want to know all the details about every bug. What you want to do is know how are the bugs and the incidents that are happening working, and how of the incidents that actually affect you. So you do not want to know about everything. You just want to know about the things that is relevant to your use of the product. There's also a level of candidness that you can have in internal communications that maybe you can't externally. Obviously, the scale of outage that you have here, that becomes a bit difficult. But I'd caution people who are seeing all the hot takes on the internet about how good or bad the customer support was, to double check with people who have actually experienced this firsthand, whether or not the support that they received from Crowdstrike internally was as bad or good as maybe the public is perceiving.
Yeah, I think especially, and you mentioned this earlier, the one of the hard parts of communication here is the bad actors, right? We're talking something, or this is a security service. The first thing that's going to happen is threat actors trying to figure out how they can exploit this as an opportunity to attack the companies affected. And so I think that creates a big, hold up, let's figure out how to communicate this publicly and properly, which is super interesting. And a lot of companies will never have this as part of their incident response. So I thought this was also fascinating and fairly complex for them to...
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of want to draw this back to, I know a lot of the people listening to this are going to be engineers working in maybe web or like the SaaS space. I think there's a lot of lessons that you can learn, or a lot of parallels to be drawn between this incident and the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, particularly around reliability and process. So one thing that stood out for me from this incident is that the way that Crowdstrike are deploying code onto these machines, it's kind of like a two-channel approach, where you ship the Falcon sensor, and that's like the binary that gets installed on the machine. But then these configuration files land onto the machines, and that can totally change the behavior of the program. Now, I think if you look at the Google Asset Rebook, or look at how a lot of deployment configuration environments work nowadays. When you deploy something into a production environment, you're deploying not just the code that you're running, but you're also deploying the config, and often kind of like uniquely identifying what you've got in production is kind of a hash of both of those things together. And that kind of sums up how people should be thinking about these things. I think it's really easy for you to, when you're working on a product where you're just shipping the code, think about the version that you've got in production is just the version of the code that you've managed to deploy, so the Docker image, and forget entirely about maybe the environment variables or some other global construct, such as your database schema, that could be impacting exactly how it behaves, often in a way that may cause a really significant downtime. So the parallel that I drew most strongly with when I was thinking about how Crowdstrike are deploying these config changes, and how the safeguards around deploying those are very different from deploying the Falcon sensor itself, is if you ever have a web application that's sat on top of a database, often you'll ship the code separately from how you will ship database migrations. And the way that you ship code is that it lands inside of your cluster, and it will often do a rolling deployment where you will gradually adopt the newest version of that code. So if anything goes wrong, you'll find out relatively quickly. You've got health checks that will detect this stuff. So ideally, you've never even exposed that bad code to customers, so there's almost no impact. So the way that people end up thinking about shipping code changes is that they're relatively safe. I do it very frequently. I know how to roll them back. Very little chance of impact. And then you have this other type of change entirely. And I think the database migrations that you end up shipping to your production environment are probably some of the most dangerous code changes that you ship. And that's because you often do them less frequently than you ship the code itself. And you also, when you ship these database migrations, it will be impacting often a single database. So you either apply the migration and it goes through, or maybe it goes through and you've applied something terrible. And suddenly, instead of this being a rolling change that impacts things slowly that you can roll back very easily, you may have taken down the whole host of everything that's depending on that database. So the characteristics here are like, there are parallels to be drawn. And I think it's no surprise to me that when you're watching companies mature, for example, when you're watching a startup become a scale up and grow into hopefully a big company like Crowdstrike, you'll often see along the way, they'll have a lot of incidents around these configuration changes, be them database migrations or just like environment variables or config that's gone wrong. And that's often just because of lack of familiarity in doing things less frequently, and the safeguards just being very different, and people not realizing maybe that they should be thinking very differently when trying to deploy something like, in Crowdstrike's position, the rapid response config, versus maybe just deploying the Falcon sensor, which has a more extensive testing process.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And the one thing that it's a bit difficult to draw parallels is the fact that they have to make a trade-off here between being very quick, right? I mean, the name of it is rapid response, and going through all of the checks and balances. And oftentimes when we're deploying a change to a database schema, we can take our time. There are still places in which we might want to go fast, especially when it's about rolling it back or rolling it forward. But I think this is quite tricky in like, what is the trade-off here and how do you balance it? And I thought it was fascinating that, and maybe we should apply some of this to how we handle SaaS on our side. Like, how much control do you give to people and how can they use that control to make these processes better? In this case, one of the things they want to fix is we're going to give more control to our customers on when these things can go out. And I think a parallel for me is, don't do schema changes on a Friday afternoon. But yeah, there...
I think I think there's always a balance of there is a clear customer need here, right? Which is that you want to get these configuration changes out really quickly, because otherwise harm may occur to the customer. I think you can kind of see this as somewhat similar to there's a clear customer need when you're deploying web applications to being able to roll things back or roll forward very quickly, because actually if you've deployed a bad change, you need to be able to get something out really quickly, normally called like a hotfix. So you can either have a process for doing these hotfixes that tries and avoids all of the safeguards, and lots of companies do have that. Like, kubectl apply comes to mind. But like one thing that we've done at Incident, for example, because we think quite carefully about reliability in this sense, is we want to be able to do these kind of more dangerous operations, but we want to do them in like a well-tested and we don't want to remove all the safety barriers, if that makes sense. We just want to remove all the ones that allow us to go faster, but hopefully keep the rest. So we have like a formal process around deploying a hotfix, which allows you to skip specific CI checks, but running only the bare essentials. So it's kind of like you need to be able to figure out how to apply the right amount of safety in order to meet the customer need. And I think that's very much what the post-incident review that Crowdstrike have just released goes into. They will be applying some level of gradual rollout to these rapid response config changes. And I think that makes a ton of sense. And they're just going to have to dial that up or down depending on how important they think it is for things to get out really, really quick versus gradually finding their way to the endpoints that people have this installed on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to move us into like how customers of Crowdstrike will handle themselves the incident, because I think that's super interesting to me. Everyone knows that Crowdstrike is going through an incident while it's happening. But what most people may not quite clock is that every single company that is affected and is potentially having a critical problem, like a Starbucks not being able to serve customers because their POS systems are down, or a hostel having issues, or an airport and airlines not being able to get passengers verified to fly them. Like every single one of those companies will be in their own incidents, trying to figure what they can do, and like they're gonna feel like things are out of their control, right? And one thing I would call out here that it's important if you're going through that process is don't play the blame game. I think it's very easy for all of those companies to go like, hey, this is not my problem, this is a Crowdstrike problem, and kind of pass it on. I think if you're in an incident in which you feel like you have almost no control over, you should really look at the things that are within your control and focus on those, while in parallel, you're trying to get as much information from Crowdstrike, from your partner, really, from your vendor, to handle it appropriately. And I look at this as if you look at the things you have control over, it's go and think outside of the box. How do you provide solutions to your customers in a situation where you don't have perfect visibility? I saw airlines, some of them would have like written by hand tickets, right? Yeah. And I think that's really fascinating, and you can't just stop and go like, well, we can't do anything, we're just waiting.
Yeah, I think there've been a lot of really great examples of this, I think, with the Crowdstrike incident in particular. So I think before Crowdstrike had announced an official remediation, there were loads of people across the internet trying to solve this. And a few people had come up with at least a temporary solution or some things that might be able to fix the device. And I think if you're in a situation where you're waiting on Crowdstrike to give you your formal kind of, this is what you should do to fix things, there's no harm assuming that will take maybe even days to arrive, and trying to execute on a contingency plan. You've essentially got all of your response team underneath you ready to respond. It makes no sense for you to just be sat there waiting for Crowdstrike to come with an update. You should be proactive and assume that update may never come. So what is something that you can do now that would try and reduce the cost of this incident if you later find out that this update is never arriving? So an example of across the last few days of these kind of hacky but ingenious innovations have been, when you think about these devices that have been blue screen of death, what you need to do is get them to an IT engineer or a technical person, or have a technical person on the end of a phone relaying this to potentially someone extremely non-technical. God forbid. I really am glad I'm not an IT engineer. But yeah, you need to get them to relay some of the instructions so that they can end up deleting a file and rebooting the machine. But this stuff does take some time. So imagine that you're at a large company with potentially thousands of these devices that you need to go through, and each device takes 5 if you're lucky, but potentially anywhere up to 15 minutes to run the recovery procedure. So there have been some people on the internet who came up with specific like USB drives that you can flash, and then you can plug them into the machine. You can execute a recovery, and hopefully it reduces the time to recover down to a couple of minutes, where before it was potentially 15 minutes plus. When you're doing that sort of thing, you can have a massive impact on the amount of time it will take for you to recover from something like this. That genuinely does change the outcome of this incident. And you're only going to get there if you're using your response team to try and kind of try out these things in advance of you waiting on the official remediation advice. So yeah, just like think outside the box and try and get ahead of things.
Well, one thing I like to think about if I'm in that situation, because I think it has happened to all of us, where one of our vendors has a problem and now we're in an incident and it feels like we can't do anything, is to think about what kind of post-mortem do I want to write, right? And so if I think of, I'm writing a post-mortem and the timeline is a vendor did a bad thing, I waited, a vendor did a good thing, it is now solved. That is going to be a terrible post-mortem, right? Like as a company, you're not going to be proud of it.
No, I know if I'm ever in an incident with you, I know you'll be thinking about what your legacy will be.
Yeah. But I think that's super powerful, right? And I think for all of these companies going through this, while this Crowdstrike incident is happening, is to, like you said, deploy their own incident response and figure out that, you know what, when I'm writing my postmortem, yes, we were also waiting on Crowdstrike, but we were also doing all of these things.
And I think an example that will probably resonate with people who work in kind of web or just general like SaaS, if you end up with a massive cloud outage where your cloud provider has gone down, whether you have a DR plan or not, DR there being disaster recovery, if you have a response team and you can afford to do it, you can just get several of the people on that response team to start initiating the disaster recovery plan while you keep some people on waiting for an update from the cloud provider. Like, do you want to wait an hour or two to find out that actually said cloud provider is down for the next few days and only then start your disaster recovery? Or do you want to find out in an hour that it will be several days, but you're already an hour through your DR plan? Like, I think it's really clear which one of those you want to be in. And you can just get ahead of this. So just make use of the people on the team and spin out a separate incident or spin out a stream for the same incident and get people moving ahead of where the main incident response might be going.
Before we go into like some takeaways from this call, which I kind of want to capture, I'll say the last thing about how I know that a lot of companies were trying to act by themselves is that in the post-incident review that CrowdStrike published, they talk about threat actors sending phishing emails, posing as CrowdStrike staff, posing as the independent researchers that I believe you talked about, selling scripts to automate recovery, right? Like, even the threat actors know that people are trying to act on it. And that's because, again, like, don't just wait, which I think is a bad thing, but as you act on it, be prepared, have a good incident response team with some preparedness that you can go through and also not be fished while an incident like this is happening. All right, so let's get into conclusions maybe, Lawrence. How does that sound? Some takeaways?
Yeah, sounds good to me. So I guess like the first thing to note is that incidents like these are hopefully rare. Like you'll hear the term black swan. Hopefully it is black swan, but they are really impactful when they happen. And the type of incident response that you need for an incident like this is substantially different than one that you may have on a day-to-day. But at the same time, all of the work that you've been doing on smaller incidents over the last couple of years has trained your team, hopefully, in good incident response, which makes them a lot more effective when something like this comes up. But yeah, so with communication, it's always a really fine line to walk. We would encourage people not to speculate too much, especially if they haven't been privy to the internal communication that CrowdStrike have with their customers. You just don't know exactly what may have gone on there unless you were the person receiving those comms. If you were the person receiving those comms and you felt like they were poor, I'd advise you to probably reflect on how you might have done this differently. I think it's a really good exercise for you, especially if you ever find yourself leading an incident, to consider how much information you might be upfront willing to give to people, especially at the start of an incident when there's lots of things that may be changing, and you might need to balance the transparency that you have with your confidence on whether or not the details that you're sharing are correct. Then I think we went into a bit of the reliability and process engineering side of this stuff. I think there are parallels to be had, especially if you're deploying things like deploying software. Make sure that when you are deploying software, you're aware when you're deploying it of the safeguards that are in place and the failure mechanisms that can happen and the way that your system may fail if you go and deploy a bad update. And if you have a critical system, you may want to try drilling things going wrong deliberately, hopefully in staging first before you move to production, just to make sure that you can actually respond in the way that you would expect to. What happens if that database migration goes wrong? Do you know how your team will respond? Do you know how to roll back? Do you know if your API will remain available? And then, finally, we discuss how you can make handling incidents that are mostly outside of your control better. Now, I think Norberto started off pretty strong with that, saying don't jump into the mud with people with the blame game. If you're offering a service to your customers and they're paying you for that service, it's really on you to shoulder the responsibility of fixing it if you fail to provide that service. Whether it was an infrastructure failure on a third-party provider that you use or not, your customers are expecting you to be good here. So pointing fingers is almost never a productive exercise. Then also just make sure that you are, with the incident response team that you have assembled, planning ahead. Assume the worst, especially when you have a third party that's gone wrong. Assume that they won't give you updates. Assume that the updates that they give you won't help, and start executing on those contingencies ahead of time. If your cloud provider is down, you can literally just start executing on your disaster recovery. There is no reason that you should wait. You will want to have been an hour through that DR progress when the cloud provider comes back and says this outage is actually going to last several days, rather than starting it only when you find that out. Hopefully that was an enjoyable listen. Good luck to everyone who is continuing to respond to this Crowdstrike incident. Anyone who is providing technical support, especially over the phone, you have my deepest sympathies. That's something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. That's it from us, I think.
And I'll end with a final note, mostly for Crowdstrike. This is quite difficult. I loved reading through your blog post, through your post-incident review. Please keep publishing those. I think they make a big difference in terms of transparency, setting the tone for the industry as well. We know it's super complex, especially when it comes to security, on giving too much information to threat actors in the moment. But after things are in a good spot, providing that richness, I think it elevates the discourse. So keep doing that. And I think your next steps make a lot of sense. And it was also really nice to see that you have communicated within your customers internally, which I fully expected, but there was a lot of noise on the internet about lack of communication to the customers. So it was really nice to see that email from the CEO.
Very reassuring.
It was very reassuring. So good job there. All right, that's a wrap for us. Bye.
Nice.